the lie we've all inherited, why justice might be a mask for power. If you think you understand justice, think again. Because what if everything you've been taught about right and wrong, fairness and law, morality and truth wasn't really about justice at all? What if it was about power? That's the question Plato threw like a lightning bolt into the foundations of Western civilization. And if you take it seriously, it will break your beliefs. Because we're not just talking about courtroom justice or political laws, we're talking about the deep structure that governs how we live, how we treat others, and what we're willing to believe about ourselves. Plato wasn't asking a legal question. He was asking a human one: do we care about justice, or do we care about control? And once you start looking, you see the cracks everywhere.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Let's go back over 2,000 years to Plato's Republic. In it, Socrates is confronted by a character named Thrasymachus, arguably one of the most brutally honest voices in all of philosophy. Thrasymachus doesn't care about virtue signaling. He doesn't care about moral ideals. He says something that, once you hear it, you can't unhear: justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. In other words, the people in power define what justice is and then call it universal. That's the moment the illusion begins to shatter. Because if you accept that definition, then justice isn't a moral truth, it's a political weapon. It's not what's right, it's what's useful. And once you see that, the entire moral structure we've built around civilization begins to tremble. Now here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. What if Thrasymachus isn't wrong? What if justice has always been shaped by whoever holds the narrative, controls the laws, or writes the textbooks? Think about it. Slavery was once legal. Colonialism was once justified. Genocide has been performed under the banner of order and peace. In every case, the people in power defined justice in a way that served their interests. And the people who suffered under that system were told they were wrong. So ask yourself, how many of your beliefs about justice are inherited from people who benefited from those definitions? How much of your morality is just a reflection of the dominant structure you were born inside? That's not just a political question. It's a spiritual one. But Plato doesn't stop there. He doesn't just expose the problem, he pushes us toward a deeper solution. Socrates, in his slow, relentless way, begins to chip away at Thrasymachus' claim. He doesn't reject the idea that power shapes perception, but he asks, is there something deeper than power? Something that power can't define? And that's where the philosophical journey begins. Because if justice is not just a mask for power, then it must be rooted in something beyond politics, something unchanging, eternal, and real. But before we can get to that, we have to ask ourselves the hardest question of all: do we really want justice, or do we just want to win? Here's the paradox: we say we want fairness, but we often cheer when the scales tip in our favor. We say we want equality, but we're quick to justify inequality when it benefits us. And we say we believe in justice, but what we often want is revenge, or dominance, or control. Plato saw that clearly. He knew how easily our moral language can be hijacked by self-interest. And that's why he made Socrates such a dangerous character. Because Socrates doesn't let anyone hide behind ideology. He forces everyone, rich or poor, powerful or weak, to ask, am I living according to truth or convenience? And in a world where moral language is often used to gain followers, votes, or money, that question cuts deeper than ever. Let's bring this into the now. Look at your social media feed. Look at political discourse. Look at how people argue about right and wrong. So often, they're not seeking truth, they're seeking confirmation. They're not asking what is justice. They're asking, how can I make my side look just? And that's the legacy of Thrasymachus. Not because he's right, but because we've allowed him to be. Because we've stopped questioning the narratives we're given. And that's what makes Plato's question so explosive. What if the real battle isn't between good and evil, but between truth and manipulation? And what if we're all complicit? Here's the deeper fear. If justice isn't fixed, if it can be rewritten by the powerful, then what can we trust? Plato's answer is radical. He says we must turn inward, not toward emotion or ideology, but toward reason, toward what he famously called the form's eternal truths that exist not in society, but in the very structure of reality. And justice for Plato is not whatever the powerful say it is. It's a harmonious order of the soul and the city. It's when every part of a person or a society does what it's best suited to do. But that's a high standard, and most people don't want that kind of justice. They want justice that feels good, not justice that is good. And that's our modern trap. So ask yourself, when you say something is just, are you describing a feeling or a fact? Are you standing on eternal ground or just repeating what your group believes? These are not comfortable questions. They're not supposed to be. Plato didn't want to make us feel better, he wanted to make us see better. And what he saw was a world where most people confuse morality with popularity, where power wears the mask of principle, and where justice, if we're not careful, becomes whatever the loudest voice says it is. And that's why we have to go deeper. Because until we understand the soul of justice, we'll keep mistaking power for truth. The soul of justice, why Plato believed harmony is the only real power. If the first shock was realizing that justice might just be a mask for power, then the second deeper shock is this: justice isn't a rule, a law, or a system. It's a state of the soul. Plato wasn't interested in courtroom verdicts or Twitter arguments. He was after something internal. And if you truly understand what he meant by justice, you'll never see yourself or society the same way again. Because for Plato, justice isn't about punishing the wicked or rewarding the good. It's not about equality in the shallow sense. It's about harmony, a kind of inner alignment, a soul where reason rules, spirit supports, and desire obeys. Only when these parts are in balance can we call a person just. And only when these parts are in balance within society can we call a city just. What does that actually mean? Let's slow down and look closer. Plato believed that the human soul has three parts. The rational part, the thinker, the planner, the seeker of truth. The spirited part, the part that feels pride, courage, and indignation. And the appetitive part, the part that craves pleasure, comfort, and material things. In most people, the appetites dominate. We chase what feels good. We follow desire. And then we try to justify our choices with emotion or intellect. But in a just soul, the rational part leads, not with tyranny, but with wisdom. Spirit supports reason with passion and purpose. And desire follows, satisfied but not in control. That, Plato says, is justice not in society but in you. Now imagine what that means for the world around us. If most people have disordered souls, if their desires rule their reason, then what kind of society do you get? A society of noise, of chaos, of people demanding justice without understanding what it is, of leaders who use power not to create harmony, but to satisfy ego. And that's what Plato feared most. Not dictatorship, but disorder. Not injustice as oppression, but injustice as misalignment. And that's why his solution wasn't revolution, it was education. The goal wasn't to overthrow the unjust. It was to cultivate the just. And that cultivation begins with one person, you. Here's the real bombshell. Plato believed that justice and happiness are the same thing. Not in the shallow, feel-good sense, but in the deepest, most existential sense. Because when your soul is in order, you don't need external validation. You don't need to dominate others. You don't even need to win. You are whole, and that wholeness is what the world is starving for right now. We see people chasing justice through outrage, through protest, through punishment sometimes necessary, yes, but often driven by disorder within. And Plato would say, you cannot build a just society from unjust souls. You can't fix the world if you haven't first fixed yourself. Now let's bring this into personal experience. Think about a time when you were caught in conflict. Maybe it was political, maybe relational, maybe internal. You felt like you were in the right. You had the facts, and the logic, the moral high ground, but still it didn't feel whole. It didn't feel good. Why? Because there was no harmony inside. You were fragmented. Part of you was angry. Another part was afraid. Another part was just trying to win. That's not justice. That's internal warfare. And Plato's point is that this mirrors society. A society is just a big version of the individual soul. When our leaders are ruled by ego, greed, or fear, that's not because they're monsters. It's because they're unbalanced, and they reflect us. What does this mean practically? It means that before you ask, what's the right side? You have to ask, what part of me is asking? Is it your reason? Your spirit? Your appetite? Are you seeking justice or are you seeking justification? That's the hard question. And it's the one we usually avoid, because it's easier to point outward. They say they are unjust. But the real power, the only power, is to turn inward and ask, is my soul aligned? That's not weakness. That's not inaction. That's the deepest kind of courage, because it requires silence, reflection, honesty. And in a world of noise, that silence is revolutionary. Let's not forget, Plato's ideal city wasn't built by force. It was built by philosopher kings, people whose souls were so in harmony that they could govern wisely, not because they sought power, but because they understood justice. And maybe that sounds impossible today. But that's only because we've forgotten the most important truth. You don't need a title to be a leader. If your soul is just, you lead by example. You influence by presence. You change the world not by shouting louder, but by living clearer. And that kind of justice can't be corrupted, because it doesn't come from the outside. It comes from the core of who you are. So here's the turning point. You don't need to wait for a perfect system. You don't need to wait for the world to get better. The revolution begins with you. With the question, is my life ruled by reason or by desire? Is my anger guided by truth or by pride? Is my idea of justice rooted in harmony or in control? These questions are not theoretical. They're transformative. Because the moment you answer them honestly, your world begins to shift. You stop needing to win every argument. You stop needing to be seen as right. You stop needing to control the outcome, and instead you start living from the inside out. And that's what Plato was really after. Not a utopia, not a perfect law, but a just soul, a person who's not divided against themselves, a person who doesn't need power to feel whole, a person who understands that the truest form of justice is a life in balance. That's not weakness. That's not passivity. That's the rarest form of strength. And in a time where everyone's shouting about justice, maybe what we need most is the quiet example of someone who's actually living it. Why you can't have justice without the truth, Plato's final warning to a divided world. Here's the final twist in Plato's philosophy, and it's the one that hits the hardest. You cannot have justice without truth. Not your truth. Not my truth. Not public opinion, but truth itself. And that's what makes Plato's view so radical, especially in an age like ours, where truth is often reduced to a point of view, a political stance, or a personal narrative. Plato believed that truth is not something we invent, it's something we discover. And justice, in its highest form, is a reflection of that discovery. Once truth is lost, justice becomes impossible. Because all you're left with is power fighting power, opinion shouting over opinion, desire dressing itself up as morality. And that's not justice, that's chaos in costume. Let's go back to Plato's most famous metaphor, the allegory of the cave. Imagine people chained in a cave, facing a wall their entire lives, watching shadows flicker across it. They believe those shadows are real. They've never seen the sun. They've never turned around. Now imagine one person breaks free, turns toward the light, and sees reality for the first time, painful, blinding, but true. And when they return to the cave to tell the others, they laugh. They mock him. They threaten him. Because truth isn't just uncomfortable, it's dangerous. It threatens the structure of the cave. It threatens the power of the shadows. And that, Plato says, is the real reason justice is so rare we would rather live in illusion than confront the truth. Now stop and ask yourself, what shadows am I still watching? What opinions do I cling to not because they're true, but because they're comfortable? Where in my life have I confused popularity with truth? Plato's warning is clear. If truth dies, justice dies with it. Because justice depends on seeing things as they are, not as we wish they were. You can't build a fair world on falsehood. You can't create harmony in a soul that refuses to look in the mirror. And yet, our world today is a marketplace of shadows. Everyone has a narrative. Everyone has a version. But who's actually turning around? Who's willing to step into the light, even if it costs them everything? That's where courage comes in, because truth isn't easy. It's not glamorous. It's not always rewarded. But it's the foundation of everything. And Plato believed that only the lover of truth, the philosopher, could truly understand justice. Not because they're smarter, but because they're willing to lose illusions. They're willing to be unpopular. They're willing to say, I was wrong. And in a culture addicted to being right, that kind of humility might be the most revolutionary act left. So ask yourself, am I seeking truth or am I seeking validation? That question might be the key to everything. Let's apply this to real life. Think about how most people form their beliefs. They see a headline. They feel a reaction. They pick a side. Then they build a wall. And behind that wall, they say, this is justice. But Plato would ask, have you examined that belief? Have you tested it in the light of reason? Have you considered the opposite view, not to destroy it, but to understand it? Because if you haven't done that, what you call justice might just be tribalism in disguise. And that's the danger. When truth becomes secondary to emotion, power fills the vacuum. The loudest voice wins. The strongest tribe dominates. And justice becomes a trophy, not a virtue. This isn't just about politics. It's about your own life. Have you ever clung to an idea about yourself, about someone you love, about what you deserve, only to realize later it was built on a lie? That moment stings. But it's also sacred, because it's the moment the light breaks in. And Plato would say, that's when justice begins. Not when you win the argument, not when you get revenge, but when you align yourself with what is true, even when it hurts, even when it costs you. Because truth doesn't serve you, you serve it. And that's what makes it divine. Here's the real test. Can you love the truth more than you love being right? Can you value harmony more than victory? Can you let go of power not because you're weak, but because you found something stronger? That's what Plato meant when he said justice is the soul in order. It's not about control. It's about clarity. It's about seeing yourself and the world as they are and acting in alignment with that vision. And when you do that, justice stops being an idea. It becomes a presence, something people can feel in you, something unshakable, something real. So where does that leave us? With a choice. You can keep chasing justice as a weapon. Use it to attack, to win, to gain power. Or you can seek justice as a mirror. Use it to see, to align, to evolve. One path leads to division. The other leads to wisdom. And the difference isn't out there. It's in you. In the questions you ask. In the truths you're willing to face. In the shadows you're willing to leave behind. Because in the end, Plato's question isn't just about society, it's about the soul. Do you seek justice because it's true? Or because it's useful? That's what breaks belief. That's what builds character. And that's what this moment right now is calling you to answer. Not with words, but with your life.